think I know most everybody here, but for anyone that doesn't know me, my name's Dennis Cilley. I'm with the Boardway and Cilley Funeral Home. I'm a third generation funeral director. My grandfather started the business in 1929. This is my son Devin. We're both licensed funeral directors and embalmers. When someone dies, we're usually called, and they're, depending on where the death is and the circumstances surrounding it, there can be quite a bit of confusion, indecision, shock. Even if it's a planned death, you know, if you know what's coming, you never know the exact time of it, and it can be a pretty confusing time for people. And we found that if people do make prearrangements, or at least if they've had a conversation about it beforehand, you know, it's helpful at the time. You know, the prearrangements can be anything from just telling your spouse or family member, you know, what you want for arrangements, to telling us what you want and we keep it on record, to picking out the casket, vault, urn if it's a cremation, and prepaying. You know, that's an option also. You know, it's good to at least have that conversation with your family member. I've got some handouts here. Devin will hand them out. There's some paperwork that the flyer gives an overview of making funeral arrangements. There's an informational sheet, which is information that we would need for the death certificate, the obituary. You know, there's an area in there that you can fill out for what you want for services. If you were to come into the funeral home and make prearrangements, this is all information that we would need. Some of it is information that we would use for the obituary also. You know, sometimes people, you know, they'll write down all the information for the obituary and then we can write it from that. Some people write their own. And then, you know, that's all things that we would keep on file, that we would have. So there again, there's any number of options. You know, no two funerals are alike. They're as individual as we all are. So I think I would like to open things up for questions. I'm sure you guys have some.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What if I just want to be cremated?
Right.
No service, no
Right.
nothing. How do I go about that?
Well, I mean, you could still prearrange that. I mean, you could, you know, we would get it down. There's an authorization to do the cremation that, you know, we could have you sign and we'd keep that on record. Get all the information for the death certificate. If there was going to be an obituary in the paper, you know, we could get that information. But sometimes there aren't obituaries in the paper either.
And what about if I prepaid and everything?
Right.
And then my son said, I want you to come live with me up in St. Albans.
Right.
What do you do then?
Well, you know, you could still use us as a funeral home. There might be, you know, some additional transportation costs. But, you know, we had it, once you make prearrangements and the money would go into a trust account. It can only be used for your final expenses, and it's set up as an irrevocable trust, which means if you were ever to go on Medicare or anything, that money wouldn't count as an asset for you because it's in a funeral trust. And what they care about is that it's in an irrevocable, which means it can't come out. So, but that money also there's a trust contract that's made out, and that's set up so that, you know, if say someone was to move to Florida or something, that amount of money could be used, you know, for any funeral home down there. If the trust account is completely paid, all of our services are guaranteed because of the interest that it would gain over the years. The only thing that isn't guaranteed would be the cash advance items, like usually we include an amount for the minister and organist and grave and that kind of thing, but those costs are outside of our control, so, you know, and they don't increase that much. But, you know, a percentage of it would go towards that, but those are the only things that wouldn't be guaranteed. But that money could be used at any funeral home, basically. You know. The only thing, if it was guaranteed through our funeral home, like say you moved to Florida and the expenses were higher down there, you know, they wouldn't be guaranteed there. Just that amount of money could be put towards it.
And what if your funeral home went out of business?
Yeah.
And this was all paid for?
There again, it would be the same. The money that we take in is taken care of by an escrow agent in Chicago. All the funeral homes in Vermont use the same escrow agent, and there again, that money could be used anywhere at any funeral home.
Thank you.
Yeah, and you would, you know, if you did that, you get statements every 6 months that tells you, you know, the interest that it's gained. All the taxes on that account are taken care of through the interest that it gains also, so there isn't anything to pay on that. Yeah.
So if you buy an urn or casket or whatever today,
Right.
and you don't die for 25 years, that money that I paid for that today is standing when the time of my death?
What was that?
The price that I paid for said casket or urn or
Right.
whatever, if I bought that from you today,
Right.
that price ain't gonna change if I don't die for 25 years.
Right, because of the interest that it gains covers the increase in the cost. Yeah. I mean, sometimes we've ran into it before, you know, they might not make that product anymore, either the casket or the urn or whatever, but in the contract, it states that we can, you know, provide something that's comparable to it. And usually when they discontinue like a casket or something, they replace it with something that's similar.
Do you see a lot of people doing that now versus say 20 years ago, you know, prepaying?
Yeah, and people do it all different ways. They will, you know, sometimes people just write us a letter and tell us what they want for arrangements, and we'll keep that in the file. You know, there's no money that transfers or anything. They just want to make sure that their final wishes, you know, will be honored. You know, other people will come in, you know, pick out their casket and vault or urn or whatever, go through everything and still not pay anything, but we have down exactly what they want. You can, you know, start out with any amount as far as prepaying and pay for it over time. There aren't any set payments that you would have to make. The only thing, it's not guaranteed until everything is paid. Like some people might take them 15 years to pay it, but then you pay what the costs are at that point, because we haven't been able to gain the interest on that account.
I'd like to make a comment.
Yeah.
My dad just died Christmas Day, and he was one of him and my mom both were ones that had all this arrangement done.
Right,
And from the children's side of it, that all to be taken care of was a real blessing.
right,
You know, you're dealing with grief and everything else
Right.
that comes with it. And they have all that stuff, you know, Dad chose his own casket.
right,
He had the cemetery plot. The only thing he didn't have yet was a headstone. But they had all those ducks in a row.
right.
And that meant so much to us that we didn't have to deal with that.
Especially if it's a sudden death too. I know when my dad died, he died quite suddenly, and I had trouble picking out the casket. And we deal with them all the time, you know. It really, you know, he never talked with me about what he was thinking for himself. He actually had started a file for his own pre-arrangements, but he never told me that, so we didn't find that until months after the funeral. But yeah, no, it is,
I
yeah,
was just gonna make a comment. I have done mine with Dennis, and he can mix and match it. I mean, I'm Birch, and we did it with several years ago, and I will say, it is wonderful to have that. And you can go to Dennis or Devin or whoever, and you can do it at a time when there's no urgency and there's no emotion, and you can joke about it. But I mean, it's so much easier to do it when you have time and can do it. But yeah.
and sometimes things change too. I
Yeah.
mean, people, you know, they get more grandchildren or whatever, and they'll write us and tell us the changes, and we, you know, some of the files we have just have tons of letters in them from people that have made changes to different things that they want. Okay, yeah,
You mentioned this kind of a little earlier, but I just wanted to highlight it just from my own experience with my mom, who did not have a lot of money. And we weren't living here at the time, we were living somewhere else. And she couldn't live at home, she couldn't live with us, she had to be in nursing, not exactly a nursing home, but sort of an assisted living type of place. We were paying for it with her own money because she still had some.
Right.
And, you know, Medicare won't take over until you get down to it. You've spent almost all your money. But the prepayment of a funeral, like you said, it goes into escrow, and that guarantees that you can have the money to give your loved one a nice funeral and not have it all spent on their last care. And ended up, she did pass before she had spent everything, and so
Yeah.
we could pay the funeral expenses, but it's, you know, it's kind of unfortunate you lose your loved one and then you don't have funds to pay
right.
for what you want to do for that.
And quite often, people, you know, before they go into a nursing home or whatever, you know, they will prepay the funeral, and then they know that that's taken care of. Because, you know, once you go into a nursing home, the funds go so quick.
I would just like to clarify what Bonnie said. My husband and I went up to see Dennis last spring, and we made their obituary and what we wanted for service and everything. And my husband passed in December, and I didn't have that to worry about. It was all done ahead of time.
I've worked at social welfare
Yeah.
for many years,
Yeah,
and the GA burial bit for people that don't have funds.
right.
I didn't know if maybe you wanted to speak to that somewhat, that, you know, because I know that the cost is a huge
Right.
burden for some folks.
Yeah, yeah, and if there isn't money there, what she's speaking about, you know, they will pay, the state of Vermont will pay up to $1,000, but you know, a cremation, without any services now is not quite 2,200, so, you know, that's, you know, they don't really cover the cost of it.
What would you, I mean, because I see on this last sheet, a home burial.
Yeah, I did include the sheet on home burial, because that's one of the questions we seem to get the most. I don't know if people are just interested or what, but those are the guidelines by the state of Vermont. It's really, you know, it's a pretty simple process.
But I'm sure, so legally though, your loved one would have to would still have to be, you know, go through a funeral home.
Right.
To either be cremated or be, you know, made ready
Or
for the burial.
For the home burial, and the big thing is, you know, a lot of times people think that they would be able to keep the person right at home, but it takes, you know, we would need a death certificate filed, and a burial permit obtained to do that. The biggest factor in that about, so it takes a little time to get it done, is the doctor's signature on the death certificate, really. That usually takes a couple days. And you know, the biggest thing with home burial, most cemeteries require, for a full burial, they require a vault, or at least a grave box that holds up half to the earth so that the grave doesn't collapse afterwards. Some people like the idea of not using a casket, or a vault. And the best way to get that accomplished for right now, and there's no place to do green burials, but is to do it at your own home. And what we suggest, and we've done it a few times, is to use the bottom part of a cremation container, which is a wooden base and has 4-inch strapping on the sides, just to put the body in that if it's not going to be in some kind of a container. And that just helps us to move the body around, get the body to the grave, and then to lower the body into the grave. If it's just wrapped in a sheet, it's not the easiest thing. Depends on the size of the person, but at least if you've got that firm cremation container on the bottom, you can do that.
But cost-wise, it doesn't really, you're not saving, I mean, you could save money there in that instance with not using, you know, a casket.
Right, we would save that, and then, I think all the home burials that we've done, you know, the families dug the grave, so you'd be saving that. And we always, you know, we help them out with the permits and everything. But it's a pretty easy process to get the site approved. It's better if you think you're gonna do it, to do it beforehand, and then that's taken care of. Yeah, that sheet that I had in there is just kind of the guidelines for that. And, you have to go through the town health officer, and usually town health officer, ones we've done have contacted me, and I go to the site and kind of, you know, do things. But
I have another question.
yeah.
If is the opening of the grave, like removing the dirt, included in this prepaid burial?
You mean if it was a full burial?
Yeah, at a cemetery.
Yeah, what I usually do when we make arrangements, I'll do, you know, the current prices today. And those are the things that the cost, the cash advances that wouldn't be guaranteed, but they don't increase, you know, that much either, so. Yeah, no, we always include, you know, if the family wants us to take care of it, you know, if it's in a church, you know, the payment for the minister, the organist, the grave, the donation for the fellowship afterwards, if you wanted that. And then if there's gonna be an obituary in the paper, we usually include, you know, the fee for that too. Sometimes people, when they're doing pre-arrangements, they don't wanna include everything like that. But, you know, if they want everything taken care of, we'll do that. We'll include, you know, having the final date put on the monument or whatever also. So those things are all taken care of.
Another question.
Yeah.
With the cremation, a lot of people put their loved ones in the urn.
Right.
So how does that work? I mean, how do you follow through on that? What do you do? What is the procedure for the whole thing?
Well, if it was gonna be a cremation, you know, we would, I mean, if there wasn't any pre-arrangements, the person would come in and meet with us. We'd get the information for the death certificate and the obituary. Have you sign the authorization for the cremation, which gives us permission to do that. We would do the transportation to the crematory. And then once the cremation's done, we would go and get the cremated remains at the crematory, bring them back to the funeral home. And then we would either use an urn that we had in stock, if that was one you selected, or we'd order one. Once that comes in, we would put the cremated remains in the urn. A lot of times now, people will divide up the ashes. You know, if there's 5 or 6 kids, they have what they call keepsake urns, which are small urns that have a portion of the cremated remains. You know, there's jewelry now that people use that, you know, they'll get the jewelry through us, or they can order it online and they bring it to us, and then we fill with the cremated remains. You know, there's any number of things, and, you know, people use all kinds of things for urns too. I was just trying to think, you know, syrup containers. Yeah, oh no, it's really been.
Milk cans,
it-
a smaller milk.
What was it?
If you have someone cremated, you
Yeah.
have to have the earth dug up and put it in there.
Yeah, you don't have to, but, you know, by burying them in the cemetery, that gives, you know, the rest of the family a place to go, like Memorial Day, birthdays, and that kind of thing. And I wanted to mention that about the home burial too. If you scatter cremated remains somewhere, like say it's on your own land, or you're buried on your own land, you should really have a right of way in the deed, especially if there's burial there, in case the land's ever sold. And then, you know, down the road, grandchildren or great-grandchildren or whatever would have a right to go back there. If you don't, and the land's been sold, you know, you're kind of limited. But,
Different cemeteries have different rules and regulations.
They do, yeah.
The veteran cemetery, I know.
Each cemetery has their own guidelines that
Yeah.
they use. You get into the bigger cemeteries like the Hope Cemetery in Barry, they require an urn vault for an urn. Most all the cemeteries in the state require a vault for full burial. Some of them require what you can set for monuments also. Yeah, but they all have different, and then if you go out of state, there's different restrictions also.
So if you made your own, say, urn,
Yeah,
is that something that you would keep a hold of until the time of death, or is that something the family would bring to you after
Usually the family would bring that to us afterwards, yeah.
There are specific measurements on that probably, or no?
Yeah, there is, yeah, yeah. You know, the cremated remains come back in a temporary container, which is, I think it's 6 inches square by 7 inches high. You know, if the urn was flatter, it would just have to be longer. But we've used all kinds of containers, and people have, you know, scattered people in all different places. And, you know, some have been shot out of cannons. And, you know, there's any number of things you can certainly do. Yeah, I knew that some that were going to Fenway Park, and I told them I didn't want to hear about it.
Against the law there.
It is against the law in some places, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it definitely would
Yeah.
be like at Fenway.
Yeah.
Golf courses and stuff. Is there more than one crematorium in Vermont?
Yeah, no, there's quite a few.
I didn't know.
Yeah, I don't know how many there is in the state. There's probably 8 or 10. Yeah.
This question's more about communication.
Yeah.
So if I bought a pre-burial, for my son who's still alive,
Right.
and then I pass away,
Yeah.
and he's still alive, how does the communication stay there so that he knows and his loved ones know that he has a prepaid burial or prepaid funeral expenses?
If you paid for him, is that what you're saying? Well, I mean, you would want to make sure he knew it and that he told all of his family. You know, usually when that's the case, you know, the family knows and they know who to call. And, you know.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you, I mean, you see cemeteries and you see lots and lots and lots of headstones.
Yeah.
Is it getting harder and harder to be buried, you know, in your local hometown?
There are cemeteries that are filling up, but you know, there's still quite a few locally that, you know, we have space enough right now. But especially where there's more cremations now, you know, you used to, you know, a full lot would be like a 10 by 10, which you could put 2 or 3 full burials in. You could put an unlimited number of cremations, really. There's a few cemeteries that they have restrictions to only so many, but the big factor there is if you're going to do gravestones for everybody. What a lot of families have done where they put a lot of cremations in is get one big monument with all the names on the back of it. And then you can just, you know, bury quite a few that way.
Dennis, what about mausoleums? What's the deal with, I know Hope Cemetery's got some.
Yeah.
How do they work, and are they available for any cemetery or just at Hope Cemetery?
I don't know, we've never really dealt with any here. I think the cost factor is such a restriction on those. You know, with that much granite, I think you'd be talking probably $50,000, something like that. I mean, basically, you're making a building out of granite. You know, it depends on the cemetery. They might have restrictions on something like that. You'd have to, when you put a monument into a cemetery, you have to deal with the people from the cemetery to make sure that, you know, it's within their guidelines. The Hope Cemetery in Barrie, they have a lot of them because everybody that's buried there was a granite worker or they own the granite company, basically. That's what a lot of those big ones are there.
I just wonder, because I know they have, some of them have like the whole family.
Right,
in this one
right,
mausoleum.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, but I don't know the cost, we've never dealt with that. Are there any other questions? One thing to think of when, you know, you're talking about pre-arrangements, a lot of people, they'll say they don't want any services or gathering or anything, and I think they think that they're making it easier for the family by saying that. But we've found over the years that, you know, people come back to you and say, wow, I wish we'd had some kind of service or something. You know, by not having a service, you're almost, people think that they will get over their grief quicker by not dealing with it. By having a service, you get to talk about that person. You know, the community comes together, it gives you all kinds of support, and it helps you start the grieving process. It's all stuff that you have to go through at some point. You know, if you don't deal with it at the time, you're gonna have to deal with it down the road. And this kind of helps get things started. I mean, it doesn't, if someone's not a church goer, it doesn't have to be a church funeral. You know, if you have a picnic or something, a gathering, so people can come together to remember that life. You know, I remember years ago, we had a burial in Sharon, and Doris Stryker, my dad, and myself were the only ones there, and you know, it was pretty sad. But we did have a service. You know, that you know, that life was lived, and it deserves to be remembered. The funeral itself, it's in memory of the person that died, but it's not for that person's benefit. It's for the living, really. And that's, I guess, if you don't remember anything else, that's the thing to remember. Yeah.
I had a little on a home burial.
Yeah.
I had a wonderful opportunity to go and dig up a grave that the people had moved and they wanted to bring their father back to another place.
Right.
Dug around the casket nicely, and they hitched on it, pull it up, and it collapsed. So I'm out of here.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a good,
Right.
a good casket.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I guess I'd recommend it if you're going to do it, put it with it.
Yeah, and we always do too. Yeah.
Well, my father was buried up in Maine. I don't know who did it, but we had the funeral with the military type funeral.
Yeah.
And whoever did it gave my sister the wrong urn, and it wasn't my father that we buried.
Oh, no.
Oh, it's not Dad? No, it's not Dad.
Did you ever find it?
We found her.
Yeah, well, that's
But that goes in with the maple syrup jug.
right.
And, you know, anecdote.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I just want to say that I feel like we in this area are so blessed to have you and your family do this, because you're so full of compassion and love for the people that you're dealing with, and it just shows.
Yeah.
And I've had some contrast with some big city funerals where it seemed like the funeral home could not have cared less.
Yeah.
They just figured to collect their checks.
Well, it's different here too, because at least 95% of the people we know personally, and we've known, you know, maybe we've done 3 or 4 generations in their family. I mean, business has been here since '29, so, you know, it's rare that we don't know someone. And it's usually people that have moved in, you know, and haven't lived here very long or something.
We wanted been here 31 years and we still family to us.
What was that?
I just said we wanted been here 31 years, but you still family to us.
Which leads me to this question. I mean, to many of us, death and dying seems depressing and you deal with it all the time.
Right.
How do you guys take care of yourselves?
Well, I mean, we have hobbies and that we do, and we're not such a big funeral home that we have something every single day. So if we can take a break once in a while, we do. If it's, you know, a young kid or friend or, you know, we've done all kinds of things that, you know, sometimes it's just brutal. You know,
I'm sure. Well, we thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
I've seen, in the past, I know, like my mother, for instance, had a, you know, a piece left for a spot, and, you know, and she gave it to somebody else who didn't have a spot.
Yeah.
Is that pretty common to see people giving up their plots in a cemetery to help other family members?
No.
You know, when it was set up for this
Sometimes,
person.
yeah. But there's so many different ways to be buried now, you know, a lot of, you know, if someone's cremated, they'll wait until the spouse dies and then they'll be buried together, you know, and, there's a lot of different, there's so many different variables now, and cremation is, you know, with cremation, you've got a lot of different options.
Where with a full burial, like you've only got probably X amount of time, right?
Right, you know, and like we don't bury in the winter, you know, and we'll store the bodies until spring, which we have storage at the funeral home that we do. But like I said, you know, there's, you know, personalities of people, funerals reflect that, you know, everyone's different. Husband and wife can be completely different. It's amazing how many times they'll come in and make pre-arrangement. One's a full burial and one's a cremation. That's not really that uncommon. Any other questions?
I'm thinking of the number of cremations have increased, I would imagine. And do you have like a ratio between that and a complete burial?
Yeah, we're
I mean,
probably,
I'm sure it varies.
yeah, we're probably roughly 70% cremation.
Yeah.
Especially this last year with the COVID.
Yeah.
A lot of people went to cremations, and we're still waiting on services for some of them, you know, until things are, we got a little creative with funerals. My mom died this last year, and we, you know, felt that we really needed to do something, and so we, the pavilion building on the fairgrounds has big barn doors on each side of it. So we opened up the doors and set up, you know, a huge amount of chairs, and people could come in and social distance themselves. We had about 7 services there after hers.
Wow.
You know, there wasn't any events on the fairgrounds because they couldn't, and so that really worked pretty well for us.
So you do funerals in people's homes?
What's that?
Do you do funeral in people's homes?
We don't, of course, that used to be customary, you know, they would have calling hours and funerals. We haven't done that for a number of years. We did, not too long ago, we took a body back to the home. They had calling hours there, and then we went back the next day and went to the church from there. Of course, that was kind of the customary way to do it. Everything was done right in the home.
Not so much anymore.
What's that?
Not so much anymore.
Not so much anymore. I mean, most people, you know, the houses aren't really set up for something like that. We have done, you know, private calling hours in the funeral home or whatever, just for the family. But there's any number of options that you can do. It's really up to the individual family, whatever's going to work best for them. Yep, go ahead.
Comment, sorry.
Yep.
Would you, I mean, maybe I probably missed the beginning, and
Yeah.
you maybe already talked about this, I'm sorry, to pop in and out.
That's okay.
Would you encourage people to begin thinking about preparations for their, not just, you know, how they're gonna pay for things and cremation, burial, that kind of stuff, but even the service would, I don't know if you talked about that at all, maybe be encouraging folks to think about, do you want music, and do you want certain people to be involved, or
Right.
location, those kinds of things. Because that's a lot of my little role in funeral planning and whatnot, is I meet with the families, and there's always the tendency, in my experience, is people will say, don't make a fuss. You know, we want it real simple and real short and sweet, and, you know, sometimes the family may not really understand what the deceased wants, and so their default is to keep it simple and short and sweet. But maybe if you were to express more about what your desires and wishes were, the family could honor that better. And so, would you encourage folks to think about, you know, beginning to prepare for those kinds of things?
Right, and that can be, you know, put into the pre-arrangements that they do with us too. You know, we can make notes about, you know, music, and if they want a soloist, what songs, you know, and that type of stuff. And then we would have it on record in the file.
And like you said before, that you can do that. You don't have to. There's no money that has to be exchanged, pretty much, for just to have, you know, some paperwork in your possession.
Right.
I'm sure for some people, I mean, like, I look around, like, I'm one of the younger people here, like your son there, you know, it's like, I think a lot of people of our generation, we're not thinking about this stuff.
Right.
You know, when in reality we should be,
Right.
because our parents are getting to that point where
You know.
they should live longer, but there's a chance that they're not
Right.
gonna. And then we're gonna be, you know, it's a pretty heavy hit when all of a sudden your father or mother or your brother or sister passes away, and,
Right.
and you are not prepared whatsoever for it.
Right.
You know, and I think about, you know, my dad, he wants to be cremated, you know, so now I'm thinking about, you know, have you, you know, have you talked to somebody, and, you know, have you got a will made up, you know, try to go over stuff with him, just because if I don't, it could, you know, just be something that's really hard to deal with.
Right.
On top of already dealing with the death, and I mean, I don't know how everybody else is, but I don't handle losing family members very easy.
Well,
Like,
nobody
can't even
does.
think hardly to drive a car, let alone try to make arrangements for the funeral.
Right.
And sometimes the nicest meetings with families are the ones when everything's planned out and been communicated really clearly, for me.
Right.
You know, when there's not a lot of discussion about what the person wanted. You know, this is what they said, and the songs they wanted, and they really desired something in the church or out in the field or wherever. Makes it a lot easier.
Yeah. And sometimes, you know, depends on the family dynamics too. it- Some families, when they get together, you know, they haven't spoken for years either, and that creates, you know, some real problems. Some siblings, first time they've seen each other face to face or spoken in 30 years might be at the funeral home. So that is helpful if you know what, because sometimes if there aren't any pre-arrangements, you know, especially if there's a lot of kids, you know, one or two will want the most expensive thing they can do, and some want the cheapest, and somewhere they've got to come together, you know, but if like, say the father or whatever had pre-arrangements, there was no question about what they wanted. You know.
And so, and typically, so if somebody already has everything set up with you, everything they want,
Right.
nobody in the family can try to change stuff.
There's a spot in the contract for the trust that if you want to designate someone that could change things, there's a spot in there to put someone's name in. So, because you don't know. I mean, if, say someone winters in Florida, they ended up dying down there, you know, things are going to be different than if the death occurred here. Yep.
I kind of want to keep Gary down my hole. I was like, do you want to take lessons on how to cut it down?
Well, you'd have to.
Or you want your son?
You'd have to dig a big hole to start with.
How does that work if you pay everything,
Yeah.
and then say you move away, and then you want to pass away in another state?
Right.
What happens? How does that
Well,
work?
that's what we were talking about earlier, that money could be used at any facility. I mean, it doesn't have to be at our funeral home, because, I mean, people move away, you know, too, and, you know, maybe they wouldn't be buried here. You know, if someone moved down south and they ended up being buried there, that money could be, you know, used at that funeral home. The only thing, it wouldn't be guaranteed through that funeral home, that amount of money. You know what I'm saying? Because the prices could be different or whatever, you know. Well, thank you guys for having us.
Thank you.
And if you have any questions that, you know, you didn't want to ask today or something, you know, you can call the funeral home at any time. And, or if you think of something else that we haven't talked about today, you certainly can.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you both.